On March 7, 1936, 19 battalions of the German army and 13 artillery groups entered the demilitarized zone of Rhineland, and this since the end of World War I. Hitler's Germany thus openly transgresses the Treaty of Versailles by committing a hostile act towards the signatory powers. Furthermore, an often forgotten but major aspect is that the remilitarization of the Rhineland exposes the Benelux countries, as much as France, to the possibility of a sudden attack by the German army. But when the situation is so clear and international law is on its side, why didn't France, which had a reputation as a military power, simply attack Germany? That's what I propose to discuss today. The remilitarization of the Rhineland on March 7, 1936, is a clear and acknowledged violation of international law, embodied by the Treaty of Versailles and subsequent agreements. But then, why did nothing happen? Why did all the signatories of these agreements, notably France, Great Britain, Italy, Belgium, and the United States, do nothing? Well, initially, France does not want to let it happen and is seeking international support. But if you've followed the previous documentaries, you can easily anticipate the response that a whole part of the Western countries make to France. Thus, the United Kingdom swiftly opts for inaction due to 3 reasons. Firstly, the public opinion of the country is little interested in the subject and generally hostile to the idea of going to war against a Germany, regaining its footing within what is, from their point of view, nothing more than its own territory. Then, from a practical viewpoint, the British Army was simply unfit to carry out an offensive ground operation of this order, at least alone, and would thus be entirely dependent on foreign support. And finally, the country's policymakers are not actually spontaneously favorable to France and mainly want to maintain a balance of power in continental Europe, and all at a low cost. Therefore, in disregard of the treaties and agreements of which they are co-signatories, they opt for a so-called appeasement diplomacy towards a Germany that is nevertheless rising in power. For Italy, it's also a cold shower for France. Despite fragile agreements established in Stresa in 1935, within which France, the United Kingdom, and Italy ensure mutual military support, faced with German rearmament, these are made obsolete the very year of their signature, when the British authorized German naval rearmament. While the Italians attack Ethiopia in total violation of international law, they drive the nail in here too. These events distance Italy from France and the United Kingdom, isolating the country internationally, rendering it insignificant in this crisis. But there are other options for France, notably Belgium, which is also directly concerned by the situation and whose help can prove to be valuable. But the Kingdom of Belgium, although aware of the situation and the danger that remilitarization represents, fears being drawn into a new offensive war. Also struggling to recover from the trauma of World War I, Belgium opts for a posture of neutrality and relies on the League of Nations for the resolution of international conflicts. Thus, the kingdom believes it is up to the League of Nations to decide on sanctions and coordinate a response. In this context, Belgium also urges France not to intervene alone. So, France is left with only one option, the United States of America. But there is little hope on this side. The United States has repeatedly expressed support for an isolationist diplomatic stance, and this since 1919. They are not interested in this matter and do not intervene. Therefore, France is objectively diplomatically isolated and must face Germany alone. However, despite this situation, France's reaction is very seriously worrying Germany. The Army Command in particular does not believe it can handle an armed response from France. But then why didn't France, even when diplomatically isolated, send its army to settle the matter once and for all? Surprisingly, that's the answer. The French army of 1936 is at a low point, paying for years of disinterest. This has resulted in budget cuts, reductions in military service duration, as well as equally well-intentioned political postures, as much as they were naive, pushing the country towards disarmament. The disarmament of the French army began in the late 1920s, before France faced major economic challenges, a fact that is not widely known. For example, between 1925 and 1930, due to particularly unattractive salaries, the French army loses just over 10% of its officer corps, while its total strength shrinks by nearly 12%. In 1930, the French army thus lacks 7,000 officers, while military service goes from 2 to 1 year, mechanically affecting the available manpower. On the equipment side, it's no better. The French army does not undergo any major modernization until the early 30s, when the first modernization movement is initiated, under the impetus of General Maxime Weygand, who was its head at the time. This was achieved amidst an adverse economic environment. However, from 1931, when the American economic crisis crosses the Atlantic and shakes France, the country's financing capabilities collapse rapidly. The nation's economic circumstances force the government to make significant cuts, hastening the reduction of resources allocated to the military. Therefore, in just 2 years, that is, in 1933, the French army is unable to properly fund ammunition needed for military operations in colonial contexts. Despite General Weygand's efforts to limit the damage, it came at the cost of an almost definitive falling out with the main political decision-makers of the time. The army is slowly losing its strength and its entire support system. And yes, we often forget, but the reduction in funding dedicated to the army means that the war industry also receives fewer orders. Thus, the French military industry is, by ricochet, forced to drastically reduce its means of production in order to avoid bankruptcy. This point is crucial for the future, as recovering an industry capable of producing volumes needed for a high-intensity conflict is lengthy and expensive, even as the French army's operational capacity relies on it. This political thought and budgetary constraints directly impact the French army's doctrine, which can only be defensive due to insufficient resources. General Weygand opposes this, but General Maurice Gamelin replaces him in 1935. More compliant towards political leaders aligning with the defensive doctrine imposed on him. Therefore, at the beginning of 1936, the French army is no longer properly equipped in terms of doctrine, equipment, or personnel in order to carry out any large-scale attack. Meanwhile, Germany has been rearming since 1922, initially covertly, then more massively and openly from 1932, embarking on the opposite trajectory. But what about in 1936? Could the French army, despite this state of affairs, carry the attack on its own? And, as surprising as it may seem considering the context on paper, the French army then remains perfectly capable of dealing with the some 30,000 German soldiers entering Rhineland from March 7th, 1936. But then why didn't France simply order its army to attack? There are several reasons for this, but the main reason from a military standpoint was that in practice, the French army of the time was much more fragile than it appeared, due to the context just mentioned. In fact, this operation required an army capable of conducting large-scale offensive operations, both quickly in their initial phase and then capable of sustaining over time. An army and an industry capable of supporting the war effort are required. But let's imagine, despite everything, that France takes the initiative to go it alone and that this intervention does not make Germany back down. How could this have happened? Initially, the army would have had to successfully carry out a quick offensive operation to prevent any establishment of lasting German defensive positions. The first point itself requires strategic, tactical, and material preparation, which did not occur in practice. And we will see why later on. In fact, without this, the French intervention would have been too slow, allowing the rest of the German army to intervene. This would have put them in a defensive position, and they would probably have been able to contain the French counterattack long enough to benefit both from the fruits of its rearmament and from French diplomatic isolation, who would here, moreover, be perceived as the author of an aggression by bypassing the League of Nations. However, let's imagine that the French Army Command prepared this operation. In this hypothesis, the first phase of it would thus very likely have gone well for her, since the French divisions, professional and capable, would have been able to dispose of the German troops without much difficulty. But it's after that things would have gotten complicated. It's crucial to note that France lacked the military capability and intention to march on Berlin. The operation would have been limited to Rhineland, with the army likely positioning on the Rhine banks and forming bridgeheads in large cities like Cologne and Dusseldorf. If successful, this initial phase would have given the French army a new mission: the occupation and pacification of the Rhineland, whose population was then openly hostile to it. Meanwhile, the German army, initially pushed back, would have then amassed in front of the French army. It is thus almost certain that it would have initially opted for a defensive posture, waiting for its time, that is, the time it could benefit from its rearmament. Although this was slowed down by the occupation of the Rhineland, the French army would have lacked just about everything to carry out its missions. To make matters worse, it would have thus found itself in hostile territory, while encountering difficulties in establishing itself effectively without being forced to maintain order. Costly and violent, undoubtedly further aggravating French diplomatic isolation as much as the army's budgetary situation. France would have had an initial victory before becoming entangled in a challenging situation to successfully withdraw from. But in reality, as absurd as it may seem, the French army had not even prepared a quick action plan in case Germany sought to remilitarize the Rhineland. But why? Well, the answer lies both in the French political climate and on the side of its military command. A crucial point, often overlooked but essential to understanding this case, is that France was in the midst of an election period in March 1936. This situation automatically limits its ability to react, especially within the political system of the time. Thus, the French Republic finds itself in a particularly unstable political situation, in which positions are gradually radicalizing and polarizing both on the left and the right. It is also important here to understand that the France of the time had a political system whose operation differs from the current operation of France. Where the Fifth Republic, which is our current republic, relies on a strong president and government, often relegating parliament to a secondary role. The France of the 30s operates with an inverse system where parliament is at the heart of political decision-making. This allows proportional representation, providing a more accurate depiction of the nation's political landscape and ideologies, thus represented within parliament, while granting it significant power. The government originates directly from parliament in both its composition and legitimacy. In this political system, the president holds minimal power. This power is then held by the president of the Council of Ministers, often referred to as the president of the council, who coordinates the government. However, the diversity of political currents and ideas and their representation in parliament require the formation of coalitions in order to form a government with a majority. One of the effects this has had in France is that it has pushed a whole section of political leaders to dilute their own ideas. In order to be able to compose with a sufficient number of political parties, the resulting necessity of constantly finding a compromise between political lines that are not always compatible has tended to soften political decisions, while damaging the ability of successive governments to opt for long-term policies. Moreover, this political system has caused remarkable instability in France. Between 1919 and 1940, a staggering 44 governments came and went, averaging more than 2 per year. This fact alone makes it difficult, if not nearly impossible, for France to conduct a coherent foreign policy during the 1930s, as much as reforms and policies leading the country in a clear direction. This reality directly impacts the country's decision-making capacity. In March 1936, outside of election periods, the political system necessitates compromise for decisions, inherently slowing the country's reactivity. The scenario, occurring amid an election campaign, makes a swift and decisive response improbable, as it was largely unanticipated. But despite everything, one thing could have motivated the ruling coalition to act. It is a clear military plan whose objectives are clearly set and the possible consequences anticipated. Thus becoming a stabilizing and reassuring factor, the French military command had the ability to influence and guide the decision. So, what was General Gamelin's position on the subject, who was then in charge of the armies? How did General Maurice Gamelin, who was then in charge of the French army, react to the remilitarization? Was he surprised by the events? And what was his opinion on the matter? Well, his reaction as well as his position is both consistent and somewhat surprising. Gamelin is firmly convinced that given the French army's situation and the country's strategy, the Rhineland should stay demilitarized. This is evident in his self-expression, such as during a meeting with the Army's Chiefs of Staff on February 19, 1936, just over 2 weeks before the Rhineland remilitarization. He declares that the territory must remain demilitarized until at least 1940 or even 1942, so that the French army has time to regain its strength. However, what is surprising is that following this analysis, as relevant as it is, it only points out the problem. General Gamelin neither prepares nor organizes anything that would prevent a possible remilitarization. And it's all the more strange as the plan for the remilitarization of the Rhineland had been known for several months already. This was known both by the French ambassador in Berlin and the Army's intelligence services, both of whom had sounded the alarm to both Gamelin and the French government. But why? Well, it's related to two things. First, the French command had long judged, based on the information it had, that this operation was planned, not for March 1936, but rather from 1937. In February 1936, it became evident that an operation was imminent, only a short month prior. There was still time then to put a plan together. But nothing will come of it, and this on the personal decision of General Gamelin. And as surprising as it may seem, it is actually not a case of culpable negligence. In fact, as we recently saw, the character is a recognized professional and intellectually capable. He thus illustrates his good understanding of the situation and is convinced that an offensive intervention by France alone will result in a defeat 2 or 3 years after the offensive began. Gamelin thus estimates two things. On one hand, that the French army is not capable of carrying out a large-scale offensive operation. As seen before, he is objectively right to think this way. On the other hand, he believes that a French offensive resulting in the occupation of part of the Rhineland would in itself trigger a chain reaction, leading to a new large-scale conflict. In other words, he fears, likely with good reason, a new European or potentially global flare-up. Who could be unfavorable to France if it does not have a solid form of international support ahead of the operation? It is with this goal in mind that he will do everything to dissuade political decision-makers from embarking on any military operation in the absence of diplomatic support. Historian Max Chiavon thus believes that General Gamelin probably deliberately overestimates German forces in his reports to political decision-makers. The 30,000 men of the Wehrmacht entering Rhineland become 60,000, while they claim that over 200,000 auxiliary or camouflage troops are already in place. The French intelligence services know that this information is simply false, but this analysis seems to have never reached the government. The general, hostile to offensive operations, did not implement a quick action plan, and so they simply stall, while pushing a plan that does not contribute to the resolution of the problem. All this can only cool down a government already hesitant and weakened by the approach of elections. Despite this, Council President Albert Sarraut initially favored intervention. He declared the day after the remilitarization, "We are not prepared to leave Strasbourg under the fire of German cannons." But French diplomatic isolation, the complexity and fragility of French politics at the time, as well as Gamelin's opinions, cooled these initial enthusiasms, Consequently, political leaders are satisfied with referring the issue to diplomatic entities for resolution. This wait-and-see stance, deferring to international diplomacy, yields nothing concrete and does not push back the German army. Europe is now faced with a new reality. The French army and the German army are once again confronting each other. Furthermore, the demilitarization of the Rhineland allowed both France and Belgium to benefit from a buffer zone, preventing any sudden German attack that we wouldn't have time to anticipate. This same area was an open door for France to the heart of Germany, as well as a royal road for the French army to position themselves along the natural rampart of the Rhine. Its presence thus in itself seriously weakened any German offensive will. Its absence, on the other hand, allows Germany to perfectly prepare its revenge, which it will do with remarkable diligence and efficiency. Thus, 4 years later, in May 1940, the German tanks surprised the Allies when they emerged from the thick Ardennes forest, as shown in the documentary on the screen.